Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and also thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me here to present. This is my first time to Kentucky, so I'm very much looking forward to learning a bit about the area and also meeting many people who are attending the conference. Now, I started my career way back in 1984, and I studied soil science at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. And many of you probably never heard of Newcastle. It's a city in the northeast of England. And it was quite an unusual thing for a young person of 18 to decide to study. Most people do biology, physics, chemistry, maths. I chose to do soil science. And actually it was quite an unusual thing for the university. I think there were only 6 of us who did the degree, and the university actually closed the degree when we all finished. Nothing to do with us, it was just simply that there was not enough interest in the studying of the soil. Now, ever since that time, one of the things that I'm constantly asked, usually with a very sort of curious expression, is why on earth did you decide to study the soil? And my response to that is always quite straightforward. I would say that few things matter more to humans than their relationship with the soil. Put simply, we rely on the soil for the production of food, but soils also play a wide range of other roles. Carbon storage, for example, and the cycling of major nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. They also, as I will talk about in my presentation, sustain a vast reservoir of biodiversity. So I would argue soils are actually paramount to society, and they're paramount to many of the services that the land provides. Now, people have known this literally for centuries. This image on this slide here, one of the first jobs I ever had was in New Zealand. It was at the New Zealand Soils Bureau just outside Wellington. So I was probably about 25, 26 at the time. And every morning, I used to walk past this mural. And essentially what it is, it's the early Polynesian settlers cherishing Mother Earth in recognition of the value and importance of soils for their society. Incidentally, they also closed this institute while I was there, which again was nothing to do with me. It was really just simply a reflection of the lack of interest at that time in the science of the soil. And if you go back even further in history, this is a slide I often use in talks because it's really sort of exemplifies how important the ecology of the soils, which is my specialization, is to society. This is actually Cleopatra, and Cleopatra was the queen of soil ecology in that she declared the earthworm sacred. And if you removed an earthworm from Egypt, the punishment was actually death. So this demonstrates that in the past, people did really value the importance of soils for the production of food, but also for other purposes that the society of these people actually depended. Now, if you look at the current situation in relation to soils, not just grassland soils, but soils more generally, the picture is actually quite dire. This was a report that was published in 2015. A wide range of soil scientists were involved in this particular report, and it really sort of provided a blueprint of the status of soils to the current state at that time. And the headline messages were quite striking. Firstly, as it says there, the majority of world's soils are degraded to some extent. About a third of those soils are moderately to heavily degraded. And we lose annually about 25 to 40 billion tons of fertile soil to erosion. And soil takes literally thousands of years to form. It's essentially a non-renewable resource over short timescales. So we're losing fertile soils at an astronomical rate. And these kind of figures, among other issues like carbon storage, for example, have started to put soils back on the agenda, the societal and the political agenda. As I said, I've studied soils for something like 35, 40 years, and I think now we're beginning to see recognition of the importance of soils in policy. And one of the things, whoops, we've lost my slides, one of the things that I think people are starting to call for, which is what I'm going to be really talking about in my presentation, is that there's a need for policies and actions for the sustainable management and protection of healthy soils. Now, my particular area of interest is very much on the ecology of soils. I started studying more fundamental aspects of soils, particularly about how plants and soil organisms interact with one another. But increasingly, we're using this knowledge to address questions related to sustainability, and particularly in relation to soil health. Now, soil health is quite a broad concept, and it includes many different factors, the physical factors, chemical factors of the soil. But I would argue that fundamental to a healthy soil is, as it says here, is a living soil. It's the ecological networks between the organisms in the soil and also between the plants that drive the many processes on which the fertility of soils depend. And that's what I want to focus on in this presentation, in that I want to really address three key points. The first relates to soil biodiversity itself. And really this is to emphasize the fact that soil biodiversity is integral to the fertility of soil. I might be talking to an audience who already know about some of these factors, but all the same, I just want to emphasize some of the current understanding in relation to the diversity of organisms in the soil and how they regulate major ecosystem processes. I'm then going to move on to bringing in plants, and I want to sort of demonstrate how plants and soil organisms are intimately linked with one another and how that knowledge can inform grassland management, particularly in relation to restoration of soil health and resilience of systems to climate change. And I just want to finish with a few words, not very much, but a few words in relation to grazing animals. I actually started my PhD working on grazing impacts on soils, and it's a topic that I've returned to recently because of growing interest in the importance of grazers, particularly for carbon storage, but also for the health of soils. So I just want to finish off with a few notes related to grazers and how they can also modify soils. Whoops. I just want to say that, just for a bit of context, the kind of grasslands that I work on are not, I would say, agriculturally productive grasslands. They're generally semi-natural grasslands, which are relatively abundant within Europe and also in the United Kingdom. And these are just a few photos. So they are agricultural grasslands. They're managed extensively generally, but they're also of high importance for conservation, biodiversity conservation, but also for cultural issues and also for the sequestration of carbon in soils. So they're not highly productive grasslands, they're more extensively managed grasslands that bring a wide range of services to people who are living in these grassland areas. So to start with, I'm just going to talk about soil biodiversity as an integral factor related to ecosystem services. Now, one of the most fascinating things personally I found about soils, particularly when I was studying soils, is the diversity of organisms that you can find living within them. There are literally billions of individual organisms and tens of thousands, if not more, individual species within a single plot of land. Now, people estimate how much of the diversity on Earth might be contained within the soil, and the sort of general figure that's given, I'm not entirely sure where this came from, but the general figure is that something like a quarter of all living diversity could be found within the soil. I suspect it's actually higher, but we lack reliable estimates at present because of the difficulties in characterizing that diversity, particularly of the organisms, the microorganisms that live in the soil. But I think it's safe to say that a vast diversity of organisms can be found in the soil. Now, just to illustrate this, this is a study that was done, it was a UK study at a single grassland site in the border country of the Scottish Highlands. And it was an acidic grassland, which are quite common within the uplands of the United Kingdom, very species poor in terms of plant diversity, and not particularly productive in terms of agricultural production. But we looked at characterizing the whole diversity of organisms in the soil, and within that species poor, nutrient poor, acidic grassland, we found some vast diversity of organisms. Bacteria, something like 10 billion individuals per gram of soil and probably around 10,000 species. Fungal hyphae, about 3 kilometers of hyphae within a single gram of soil and about 100 species. But there's also lots of animals, millions of nematodes, microarthropods, which are mites and collembola, encotrade worms, and also earthworms. The diversity of life within a single metre squared of soil is literally astronomical. And that diversity is also under considerable threat from human activities. Many different factors detrimentally affect the diversity of life in soil. Intensive agriculture, overgrazing, deforestation, war, pollution, the list goes on and on. But perhaps the biggest threat, I would argue, is land use change, things like deforestation, for example, and also the intensification of agriculture. Now, this is just to illustrate this. These are data from a large-scale study done across a broad range of sites in Europe, in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Czech Republic, and also Greece. And at each of those sites, we had a gradient of management intensity, from intensively managed arable sites to crop rotations through to extensively managed grasslands. And you can see in this graph, the one on the left is the number of functional groups within the soil food web. So things like different types of organisms, as I showed you previously, the different animals and microbes. And on the right, it's the number of species. And you can see for all the graphs, across all the countries, there are significant declines in the numbers of functional groups with intensification of agriculture, from grassland through to arable, intensive arable, but also there's a decline in the number of species. So essentially what's happened, if you were to summarize that, is you've got simplification of the soil food web, both in terms of its trophic complexity, the numbers of different functional groups, but also the numbers of species within those functional groups. So you're simplifying the actual complexity and diversity of the soil food web. So the obvious question is, how does that impact ecosystem function? Now, when we talk about diversity-function relationships, most of the emphasis is placed on the number of species. But when you look at the soil and other ecosystems, I personally think you need to look at two different types of diversity. There are many types of diversity, but two are broadly important. The first is what I've called vertical diversity, and that's really the trophic relationships between the different organisms within the soil. So, for example, the predators feed on the animals feed on the microorganisms, and it's these trophic interactions which regulate the processes that occur within the soil. And then we've got horizontal diversity, which is more commonly used, which is really the number of species that you find within the soil or within a community or within a particular functional group. Now, I just want to give you some evidence from different studies to support the idea that declines in either of those components have significant implications for the functioning of the soil. I should say that it's always difficult to disentangle the organisms from other factors, the physical and chemical factors of the soil, but these are experimental studies that hopefully demonstrate the functional importance of these organisms through these two different pathways. So this is first vertical diversity. So this is the trophic relationships. And I've got some studies here. There are 4 graphs. They're quite detailed, but I can demonstrate or articulate the key messages from these studies. They're all very early studies. One of them was done by Elaine Ingham way back in 1985, and some of them are my own work done in the 1990s. And what they all show in these bars is if you increase the complexity of the soil food web, so we've got plots in the top left-hand corner with just microbes, for example, or just a plant. You add bacteria, and then you add nematodes that feed on those bacteria and recycle nutrients within the system. As you increase the complexity of the food web, in all cases, you increase the availability of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and you increase the growth of the plants. In the bottom graph, for example, these are 2 studies that we did on grassland plant species, for example, where we had controls with no animals. The second plots along with nematodes and collembola, and then when you put them together, you get these synergistic effects where you have an increase in the availability of nutrients and the uptake of those nutrients by the plants. So I would argue these are just selected studies. There are many studies that demonstrate if you increase the complexity of food webs, you increase the cycling of nutrients and the uptake and growth of the plants. Now, they're very basic studies. We also can look at food webs in much more detail and also in relation to environmental stresses, things like drought, for example. And this was a study we did some years ago looking at different food webs from intensively managed grasslands and more extensively managed sites. And one of the things that becomes quite characteristic when you look at different grassland systems is that extensively managed systems, for example with low fertile or no fertilizer and low grazing pressures, they tend to have fungal-dominated food webs. Whereas when you increase the intensification of agriculture, those communities shift, as I showed you previously, they become less complex and less diverse, but they also become dominated by bacteria and the consumers of those bacteria. So what we did in this study, it was Francisca de Vries who did the bulk of the work. We took soils from different systems and then we shocked them with a drought event. And droughts are becoming more frequent and severe, so we looked at the impact of the drought on the food webs and the cycling of nutrients within the soil. And we found from a range of different studies and sites that basically these fungal-dominated food webs, which are more diverse, more complex, are better able to resist a drought event than are these bacterial-dominated food webs. But furthermore, the evidence, I can't point to it unfortunately because I don't have a pointer, but the evidence suggests that that had a direct link to the loss of nutrients from the soil. In other words, these fungal-dominated food webs, which are associated with extensive management, were more resistant, but also they reduced the loss of carbon and nitrogen from the soil as leachates and also from the release of greenhouse gases. So it seems that these food webs, these more complex, diverse food webs, fungal-dominated food webs, are also more resistant to perturbations, such as drought, which is increasing in occurrence in many different situations. Just one other example, in case I haven't convinced you already, this was actually a pan-European study where we took soils from different sites across Europe. It involved a vast range of different specialists looking at different organisms in the soil. These graphs all look very complicated, but essentially they all say a similar thing. At a European scale, we could predict key processes of carbon and nitrogen cycling on the basis of different groups of organisms present in the soil. I can't actually read them from here, but there are, but changes in the abundance of nematodes, changes in the abundance of mycorrhizal fungi could predict key processes of nutrient cycling at a European scale. So in other words, these food web properties, as we said here, explain ecosystem services, in this case, at a regional, but also at a local scale. What about horizontal diversity? Well, I've given you this image because studying horizontal diversity, I think this is quite an important point, is that most work on species diversity has been done in plant communities, which are relatively easy to manipulate. But if you want to manipulate soil organisms, it's a very difficult thing to do. This is one of my colleagues, Dave Johnson. He looks a bit dodgy there, having a pipe in his mouth, sucking up things from the ground. But essentially what he's doing is extracting animals from the soil. So you have to do this physically to get enough animals to construct diversity gradients to be able to do these experiments. And I did a lot of this work myself in the 1990s and 2000s, but I gave up after a while because of the amount of work involved in doing these studies. But again, if you just look at studies that are emerging, looking at diversity in terms of the number of species, you can see that there tends to be a positive relationship between the functioning of the soil and the number of species contained in those soils at different scales, both locally, in the top corner, so it's a classic study by Wag, and the bottom graphs show relationships across broad spatial scales where the functioning of those soils was related, only statistically related, to the number of bacteria found in the soil. And also in our own work, these are some studies we did recently. It was Marina Semchenko who did the actual work, where we looked at the performance of individual grassland plants, a wide range of grassland plants common to British grasslands and European grasslands. And what we found is that the performance of an individual plant was dependent or could be explained by its impact on the diversity of either mycorrhizal fungi, which are beneficial organisms to the plant, or the pathogenic fungi, which obviously have negative effects. So essentially, grassland plants cultivate a community within the soil, and if they commute a community with high diversity of mycorrhizal fungi, that will translate to increased performance of that plant in subsequent generations. Whereas conversely, plants that select more for pathogenic organisms, and I'll say more about this in a moment, they obviously perform worse in subsequent generations. So these plants on the right would accumulate pathogens. They live fast, but they die young. So hopefully that sort of demonstrates the importance of diversity in the soil. It's just a snapshot of the literature. There's lots of variation in the literature and lots of other factors at play, but hopefully it at least demonstrates that these organisms do play key roles. So therefore we need to be concerned about them if we're interested in soil health and maintaining the productivity and resilience of our systems. I now want to bring plants into the question, which is really the key area of research that myself and my colleagues have focused on. And again, one of the sort of fascinating things about plant relationships with soil organisms is that if you simply grow a broad range of grasses or other plants, as we did in this particular study, so we grew individual monocultures in a range of different plots. Again, these are British European grasslands types, about 20 different species. There is incredible variation in the microbial communities that you find around the roots of those plants. The plants essentially cultivate distinct microbial communities which will have subsequent effects on the performance and growth of those plants. These are just data on fungal communities. They're pathogenic organisms, mycorrhizal organisms, and saprotrophs, which are the decomposers. And you can see in these graphs across a broad range of different plant species, legumes, grasses, and also forbs, there is considerable variation in the abundance and also the diversity of this broad range of different microbial groups. Now, one of the things that we've been trying to study is what explains that variation. In other words, why do some plants select for groups of organisms that are beneficial, whereas other plants might select for organisms that have positive effects on their growth, but also on the wider environment. And the frame that we've been using is a so-called trait-based framework. And the general idea is that the traits of the plants in relation to their growth rate, or what we call the economic spectrum, can explain the variation in their associated microbial communities, but also how they impact on the soil. In this case, in relation to carbon storage, which was the major focus of this framework when we first put it together. And the general idea is that fast-growing plants, the kind of ones I mentioned before that accumulate pathogens fastly, they grow fast and they die young, the faster-growing plants promote these bacterial-dominated food webs, which are associated with rapid cycling of nutrients, but also the loss of nutrients and carbon from the soil. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, these slow-growing plants, which have recalcitrant litter, they invest a lot of carbon in their roots, they're more slow-growing in nature, they tend to promote this more fungal-dominated food web and associations with the mycorrhizal fungi. And what we proposed in this study was that that would be related to the sequestration of carbon in the soil. And we'd expect more carbon in a community with more slowing growing plants. So what evidence is there to support that? There's a lot of graphs on that particular slide. I can't even see them from here myself, so I suspect some of you at the back can't see them. But essentially what they all demonstrate is that at an individual plant level, on the left, in the middle, that's actually a map of England and grasslands across England. We sampled a broad range of different grassland sites. And on the far right, these are sites taken from Australia and the United Kingdom, so cross-continental comparisons. And in all these studies, we could explain a portion of the microbial community on the basis of certain leaf traits, in particular, specific leaf area, but also the nitrogen content of the shoots. And generally what we found, and I stress generally because there are many different factors involved, but generally slow-growing plants tended to promote these more fungal-dominated communities, low rates of nutrient turnover, more conservative in terms of nutrient cycling, and also they tended to have higher carbon contents at a regional scale. So across the United Kingdom, the graph in the middle, for example, we found that the relative abundance of fungi could be predicted by specific leaf area and the amount of carbon contained in the soil. And then if you have these fast-growing plants, the ones that live fast and die young, they tend to have bacterial-dominated communities, high rates of nitrogen mineralization, and low amounts of carbon in the soil. Now, these are pretty big generalizations, but at least at this broad level, they seem to be relatively robust. We also know that interspecies variation within plants and their traits can explain key groups of organisms involved in nitrogen and carbon cycling. Now, in this study, we were looking at root traits, which are actually better predictors than shoot traits of different properties in the soil. These studies all relate to different grassland species. So on the left-hand side, we had about 20 different grassland plants, whereas on the right-hand side, we had a similar number of grassland plants. British grassland, European grassland species. And in the first graph, what we did was look at functional genes related to archaeal ammonium oxidizers. So these are microorganisms involved in the nitrification process. So they produce nitrite from ammonia, which is then mineralized to nitrate, which is either taken up by plants or lost through denitrification and leaching of nutrients from the soil. So we looked at the abundance of this functional gene across a broad range of species, and what we found was that it related to the nitrogen content of the roots and also the growth strategies of the plants. So basically, fast-growing plants promoted the activity of archaeal ammonium oxidizers, increasing the availability of nitrate in the system, whereas conservative plants had an opposite and actually a negative effect on these actual processes. If you look at the other graph there, again, it's difficult to read, but essentially what that looks at is plant performance. I showed some data before about certain plants encouraging pathogens, which have a detrimental effect, whereas other plants encourage mycorrhizal fungi, which benefit their growth in subsequent generations. But what we found was that those feedbacks could be explained by shoot nitrogen content, but also the diameter of the roots of those plants. And basically what we found was species or grassland species with high nitrogen content, shoot nitrogen, and very fine roots tend to accumulate fewer beneficial organisms, i.e. mycorrhizal fungi, but they attract more pathogenic organisms with a net negative effect on their growth. So essentially, it demonstrates that the traits of the plants, in this case root nitrogen and also root diameter, thinner roots, tend to encourage plants. They're faster growing plants, but they accumulate pathogens which have a net negative effect on their growth in subsequent generations. So that's just demonstrating individual species effects. I just want to move on now to how we might use some of this information in terms of how we actually manage grassland soils for processes and also for their resilience. And one of the ways that we've been looking at this, which I think is an area which is quite topical, for example, in regenerative type agriculture, is the idea that you can select different combinations of plant species and that those combinations will have complementary effects that could have benefits for things like carbon storage, or they could also have benefits for things like resilience of plant communities to environmental change. Now, as I keep stressing, there are many, many different mechanisms by which plant diversity can impact on below-ground communities, and those relationships are probably very context-dependent. They vary depending on soil type, environmental conditions, etc. But in general, there seems to be a consensus that higher diversity grassland communities have benefits for plant production, benefits for their resilience, etc. The list goes on and on. And it also seems that higher diversity grassland communities have benefits for the diversity of organisms in the soil and also for key processes, in this case carbon sequestration. Now again, when I was talking about diversity before, I think it's important to recognize that this isn't just the number of species, it depends on which species you select and the traits of those particular species. But all the same, in all these different studies, you can see that the number of species increased, in the first case, the amount of microorganisms and mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, beneficial organisms. There was an increase in the diversity of animals in the soil in one particular study. This is work in Jena by Nico Eisenhower. And in the same area, there was seen to be an increase in the sequestration of carbon in the soil. As I said before, these effects are probably strongly driven by the identity of plants included in those mixtures, but all the same, these mixtures seem to have benefits for these processes within the soil. We also know that they have benefits for physical properties in the soil. When I was at university, I didn't particularly enjoy soil physics so much, but I've returned to it recently. And in this case, what we did was look, it was Ian Gould, a PhD student, working with myself and John Quinton in England. And what we looked at was aggregate stability, which is a key measure physical property of the soil, which is important for carbon sequestration, but also for the movement of gases and water through the soil. And we did studies in pots, where we had different mixtures of grassland plant species, and we also did studies in the field, again at this Jena experiment in Germany. And what we found in all these different situations, when you increase the diversity of grassland plants, you improved the aggregate stability in the soil. And we explained those responses on the basis of complementary root characteristics of the plants. Certain traits of the plants benefit the formation of aggregates in the soil, promoting the physical stability of the soil. The other thing I touched on previously was resilience. Well, in this particular study, what we did was take some arable sites, that had been hammered by intensive arable agriculture, year-on-year intensive agricultural practices in relation to arable production. And what we did was sow in mixtures of different grassland species, but we mixed them on the basis of their root characteristics, particularly knowledge of their rooting depth. So what we did was essentially create a gradient of different grassland communities sown into these degraded soils that varied in their rooting depth. So at the far end, we had communities with a wide variety of different rooting types where you get complementary of the different plants in terms of the access to resources and their resilience to different stresses. What we did here was then impose a drought. You can see there's a lot of emphasis on drought because it's increasing in frequency and intensity. And we looked at the impact of that drought and also the recovery. And we measured a wide range of different processes in the soil. This is just one example. This is nitrogen mineralization, which is the breakdown of organic to inorganic nitrogen. And that graph basically shows that the greater the diversity of rooting depths within the soil, the more resilient that system was to that perturbation. In other words, it could withstand that drought event if there was a greater diversity in rooting depths. Whereas monocultures with single rooting depths were unable to actually withstand that drought event. The impact was much greater, and the longer-term effect on productivity of those grasses was also more significant as a result. Just a couple more graphs on this, just in relation to restoration. Is one of the sites that we work on is the so-called Colt Park experiment, which is in northern England, which is where I'm from. It's very close to where I work. And this is an experiment we've been running since 1989 with different management interventions to increase botanical diversity, but also to deliver multiple ecosystem services. And one of the things that we recently did, we haven't published this work, this was work done by a postdoc, Shangxi Liu. He looked at the temporal variability in plant production over 10 years across all these treatments. So looking at interannual variation in yield across all these different sites. And essentially what we found is that the treatments which were most effective for biodiversity restoration created communities that were more stable over that 10-year period in terms of their productivity across that period when there had been several droughts and changes in interannual variation in climate. But the reason I show this in particular is because on the bottom line of that graph is resistance of soil multifunctionality. So that's multiple functions performed by organisms within the soil and how they simultaneously respond to a perturbation event. And what we found was quite striking in that there's a positive correlation between the two. In other words, the more stable the plant community is over this 10-year period, the more able the microbial community in the soil and the functions it provide were able to similarly resist a single drought event, suggesting there is tight coupling between the plant and the soil community, emphasizing the point about these linkages between the two. Now, the last graph I want to show you in relation to these linkages is just to show that intensive management, and when I talk about intensive management here, this is relative. These are these sort of semi-natural grasslands, so intensive management is probably, 10 sheep per hectare and a little bit of fertilizer. They're not heavily fertilized grassland systems, etc. But one of the things in the north of England, you can see in that graph there, we have all these walls, and these walls were built for political reasons related to land ownership rather than anything to do necessarily with the land. So we have all these dry stone walls, we call them, separating land that could be historically extensively managed or historically intensively managed for a variety of reasons based on land ownership, the farmers, etc. But what we did in this study was pulse label the plant communities with carbon-13 carbon dioxide, so you could trace the uptake of the carbon by the plant through photosynthesis, its transfer into the soil to the roots, its transfer to all the microorganisms and animals, and its subsequent loss back to the atmosphere. And we did this after imposing a drought event. So we could look at how drought disrupted the flow of carbon, or the coupling of carbon from the plants to the organisms in the soil and its subsequent loss to the atmosphere. I should say this was work done by Mathilde Chommel, who's recently published the work just before Christmas. And what you can see in this graph, again, you might not be able to see at the back, but essentially the more intensively managed sites took up more carbon by the plants, 13C carbon by photosynthesis, but there was less transfer of that carbon to the organisms in the soil. They essentially bypassed the microorganisms, and the majority of that carbon that was transferred below ground went straight back to the atmosphere, was released back to the air. Whereas these extensive systems with these fungal-dominated communities basically buffered. There was no net effect. They could buffer and continue to supply carbon to the organisms, the beneficial organisms, in response to this drought event. So in other words, as it says in the title of this paper, intensive management, and I stress this is still relatively intensive management, but this grassland management disrupts these linkages between above and below ground communities, which I would argue are key to the maintenance of this functioning of those grassland systems, but also their resistance to things like extreme events. Now, I just want to finish off by saying a few words about grazers. I think I've probably got about 5 minutes, so that's okay? That's good, just for about 5 minutes. In that, I actually started my career working on grazing. I'm from a sheep farming family in the north of England, and that's one of the topics which has always been a sort of focus of my work. But I've recently sort of returned to this area, mainly because of a lot of discussions and debates in relation to whether or not grazing animals are beneficial in these more semi-natural type of grasslands on which I work on. And I just want to show you some sort of early results from the kind of studies we've been doing here in relation to soil health, but also in relation to carbon sequestration. Now, it's quite clear that excessive grazing, high numbers of grazing animals, have detrimental effects on the functioning of soils and the diversity of organisms contain them. These are data actually from a study we did on the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, which I think our next speaker might be talking about, whereas here we had a gradient of land degradation, which was driven predominantly by high livestock numbers, and I mean really high livestock numbers. And you can see in these graphs, this is ecosystem multifunctionality. Multifunctionality is really sort of an index of multiple functions on which the soil performs. And you can see in this particular study, it was Shan Lu who led the paper, as you go along from pristine through to these more extreme high grazing pressures, there's a significant decline in the functioning of the soil, physical properties, chemical properties, the diversity of organisms in the soil. But also after 10 years of restoration, in this case using monocultures of grassland species, there's hardly any improvement in the multifunctionality of those soils. So it's quite clear that sort of extreme amounts of grazing can have detrimental effects. And in this paper on the left, we did an assessment of global grassland degradation, and overgrazing is obviously one of the key factors causing detrimental effects on these systems. But if I go back to when I first started doing my PhD and work that was done around that time, it's quite clear that grazers also induce feedbacks with soil organisms, which can have significant benefits for the functioning of those systems. These grazing animals are absolutely integral to many of the natural and semi-natural systems in which we study. This is just one example. Defoliation, for example, can trigger a pulse of carbon below ground to the microbes, stimulating their activity, which leads to an increase in nitrogen uptake by the plants, which is thought to be a key mechanism promoting the regrowth capacity of many grassland plants in these grazed systems. So grazing animals obviously have a key role in maintaining the functioning of organisms in the soil, and they're obviously intimately linked through a range of processes. But it's also quite clear that they have big effects on things like soil carbon sequestration. And this was a study which sort of demonstrates how grazing in the UK kind of landscape, so I stress these are just UK grasslands, can impact on the amount of carbon contained in the soil. This was work done by Sue Ward some years ago now. It was published in Global Change Biology. And what we did was sample soils to 1 metre depth across a broad range of grasslands in England. And what we found was quite striking. I think one thing in particular is that grasslands contain a vast amount of carbon. Something like 2 billion tonnes of carbon to 1 metre depth within UK grasslands. So they contribute significantly to carbon storage. And much of that carbon is actually at depth below 30 centimetres, which is where most inventories of carbon typically stop. But the other thing we found was that soil carbon content was 10.7% greater in intermediate relative to intensively managed grasslands. Now, there are many different factors at play in terms of management intensity, fertiliser use, grazing pressures, etc. But if you look at grazing pressures, that tended to demonstrate that around 1 to 1.5 livestock units per hectare per annum tended to be associated with higher carbon stocks, whereas higher than that, there were negative effects on the amount of carbon contained in the soil, and these are stocks down to 1 metre in depth. And you can see that the responses actually trickle right down to 1 metre in depth. So it seems that intensive management has detrimental effects on carbon, at least in UK grasslands, whereas the intermediate to lower levels have beneficial effects. And I stressed before that many of the systems that we work on are what we would call extensively managed grassland systems that have been grazed for literally centuries from sheep, but also from cattle. The other thing that we recently did, and I've just got a couple of slides to finish off with, is we looked at a network of grassland sites across the United Kingdom, right from the southern area, I don't know how many people have been to the UK, but right from Exmoor and Dartmoor in the south, right up to the Scottish Highlands. So this is a vast biogeoclimate gradient. And what we did was we had 12 different sites. Each site we had replicated grazing exclosures. So these are sites where grazers had been excluded from semi-natural upland grasslands for more than 10 years, and in some cases up to 50 years. Our criteria was 10 years of grazer exclusion, and the main grazer in these cases would be sheep, purebred sheep. The graph on the right or left is the diversity of a whole range of microorganisms in the soil. I started this talk talking about all the different types of organisms. Here we use molecular tools to look at bacteria, fungi, nematodes, mites, springtails, plants, etc. And a broad range of different types of diversity. And across all those different sites, the exclusion of grazers has had a net negative effect on the diversity of all trophic groups contained in the soil. So it seems that in these type of grasslands, I keep stressing that these are just one particular type of grasslands, extensively managed upland grasslands, we call them in the UK, but it is a strikingly consistent response in terms of reducing the diversity of organisms in the soil. The last graph I have relates to carbon sequestration. Across all those sites, actually, there was no significant difference in grazed and ungrazed sites in terms of the amount of carbon contained in the soil. And when we looked at different predicting factors, nothing really came out other than the initial carbon content in the soil. And what we found was basically the effect of grazer exclusion on carbon storage across all these broad range sites could be related in part to the initial amount of carbon. Basically, sites where there was less carbon contained in the soil, there was a positive effect on carbon accumulation as a result of removal of grazing, whereas where there was higher amounts of carbon in the soil, and these are pretty organic soils, some of them, there was generally a net negative effect. I can talk more about the mechanisms involved in that, but we think it's mainly related to the actual changes in vegetation as a result of removal of grazers, which lead to mining of organic matter in the soil by shrubs, for example. But essentially, it does demonstrate, at least, that these changes in grazing management, in the UK at least, could have significant implications for the amount of carbon contained in the soil. There are many, many, many uncertainties in this particular area. I think it's a vast area for future exploration, and it's an area that we're hoping to look at more because many factors will determine the amount of carbon in the soil. Things like grazer type, grazer diversity, grazing intensity, and all these other parameters. But I think these kind of data at least emphasize, along with other studies, that it's an area that is fruitful for future exploration in terms of the factors that regulate the amount of carbon in the soil. So just to finish, hopefully I've convinced you, for those who were not convinced before, that soil diversity does actually matter. It's fascinating in its own right, but it's also functionally important. I think there is a need for great awareness of the importance of soils and their biodiversity. Soil quality in the past was generally motivated by physical chemical measures, whereas increasingly biodiversity is being integrated into its assessment. And I think there is ample opportunity, I would argue, to develop new ways of reshaping and enhancing that soil biodiversity to be benefits for sustainability and for the health of soil. And on that note, I'll finish, and thank you very much for listening. Yeah, I can hear.
For the extensive versus intensive, those terms are a little different. I'm used to hearing about management intensive grazing would be, you were kind of talking about intensive in maybe a different, highly fertilized. Intensive grazing, if your daily moves or twice daily moves, would you call that extensive in the way you're speaking?
Okay. Yeah, and I guess for those who can't hear, the question's really about how we use the term intensive and extensive grazing and what we actually mean by it. As I sort of stressed, it's something when we write papers we get picked up on all the time because they're sort of terms which I'd say are pretty, we use them in the context of these generally more extensive systems. So all the grasslands that we work on will be permanently grazed sites, and generally extensive systems would be grazed all year round pretty much, maybe not so much in the winter with very low stocking densities, maybe 1 to 1.5 sheep per hectare or maybe some cattle as well, so very, very low because their main management is more for sort of conservation purposes at the moment, but also for sheep production, whereas intensive would generally be sites that have had they would be grazed for significant periods of the year, but they'd also be cut for things like silage and in some cases for hay. So they wouldn't be sites, the ones that we use, they wouldn't be sites where there is things like rotational grazing and etc. They'd be more sort of permanently grazed, permanent pastures, basically.
And the extensive would be set stock, but just very low set stock?
Yeah, set stock, very low, yeah. And as I said before, they're generally sheep grazed, but also some of them would be mixtures of cattle and sheep. But they generally would have no fertilizer added to them. They would be free-ranging grazing, so there would be a lot of heterogeneity as well within the landscape.
Thank you.
So I guess in relation to that, all those, some of the things you mentioned, one of the things I suspect with grazing that does have a big effect is the timing of grazing. I suspect will have quite an enormous effect on the properties within the soil and also on things like plant diversity, which is not really encaptured within what we studied. Yep.
Diversity in the soil. Sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So, as you add legumes to a stand,
legumes. Sorry. Yeah.
What impact does that have on diversity of soil microbial community?
Yeah, so the question, I guess, for people who might not have heard that, is it's about legumes and how legumes impact soil biodiversity. In our studies, I'd say, I show graphs of plant diversity and how that impacts on soil properties. Legumes generally are one of the main drivers of that kind of response. So in the grasslands, for example, that we work on, I mentioned a long-term experiment. We have a treatment where we add red clover, Trifolium pratense, and that has a disproportionate effect on the system compared to other grassland species. But having said that, there's also complementarity with all the other different grasslands, so that the legume effect is often dependent on the other species that are around them. But almost certainly legumes have a big effect on the diversity of organisms in the soil. Hope that answered your question.